Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
Happy New Week.
Happy New Week, yeah.
Well, good, and we're back at it again, trying to solve some problem. But anyway, we're going to talk about a potential problem being solved. Can you believe it? After all this time and all this wonderful government experience, they're talking about firing Fauci.
Yeah.
But he'll go out gracefully, I'm sure. He will resign or, retire. He's ready to retire. He'll probably get a nice benefit. And he's been making a lot of money. He's probably saved a lot of money too. But anyway, the story is he's in over his head. People have had to retract. Even the bad guys had to retract stories, because if you suggested a year or two ago that there's some shenanigans going on with reports and what's happening, you could be woke. You could be in big trouble if you did that. But now, Washington Post and some others say, well, maybe we made a mistake.
Yeah.
And they're using the word lying, before the committee. So when that happens, I think the handwriting may be on the wall, and I think it will be a benefit to the country. But I doubt if there will be any real repercussions with Fauci. But this is, I think, significant. It changes the nature of this whole debate.
Yeah.
Of course, they have somebody in there right now that's probably no more trustworthy than he was in feeding us the information. So it'll be interesting to see in the next couple of weeks what happens, and whether or not he will be submitting his papers for retirement.
Well, it's amazing how his star, does seem to have not just faded, but crashed and burned. And we joked last week, wouldn't it be ironic if the person who's viewed as the savior, saved us from COVID, actually had a hand in its development and release? And of course, we've said it before that, this was considered a conspiracy theory. If you suggested the possibility that this virus got out of a lab after gain-of-function research allowed it to jump more easily from human to human, you would be blocked out of every social media and you'd be considered a very bad person. Well, as you point out, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, all of the main New York Times, all of the main, even the White House now. Remember, they shut down an investigation that began under Trump because they shut down anything that had anything to do with Trump into the possible Chinese origins of the virus. They quietly said, okay, we're going to have to start this up. We've got 100 days. We've got to figure out what's going on here, where this virus came from. So everyone is doing an about-face on this. And unfortunately, what that means is that Fauci is in the hot seat. And we know from what Senator Paul said and his being questioned by, I think, Representative Kennedy or Senator Kennedy about the issue of this research that was going on. He flat out lied to Senator Paul. At least that's what Senator Paul said, and we did find out. He said, no way, we never funded gain of function, never funded it at all. And then it turns out they did fund it, but through a cutout, through this company that was getting money from it. And that's just one of the many things that are now coming out that put him square in the middle of what's going on.
And there's been some discussion of this going on, because in 2012 they had him saying, well, yeah, there could be some risk, but it's worth it. But the real incident occurred after Trump was made president, a month or two, early part of 2017. All of a sudden, this is a big deal. But and this was a renewal of that principle of gain of function.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I don't fully understand, where they stand right now, because I don't believe for a minute they're reporting people who are sick and they've identified the virus. They probably don't even know how, because they have such trouble, testing for COVID, because some people say 90-some% of the tests were unreliable. So how are they going to test for the other? But the principle of what was happening there, messing around and tinkering with these viruses, potentially making them very, very dangerous, and then having somebody do this in a way in secrecy, where on this go around in 2017, It looks like nobody in the administration was told about it. But then once again, who really was running thing at that time? They were, still trying to impeach Trump. At least they were starting to try to get rid of him and try to keep him from getting in office, and that's what was happening. So they didn't have any time to deal with this. But this is. This is important for a lot of reasons. Of course, it fits into my argument that the government and medical care should be separate. It shouldn't be the same. Once you get into it, who should be surprised that the drug companies will be into it too, and the drug companies directing investments, and all of a sudden we have more vaccines than ever before, and there's somebody making billions of dollars. So it's something that this problem is going to last as long as there's a mixture. It's sort of like saying, well, we're going to have a little bit of mixture between church and state, but we're not going to have real authority. And of course, guess what happened during the pandemic? They locked people out of their churches. They couldn't even go. So there is a march toward regulation and destruction of the culture that we live in, and I think that's part of what we're looking at.
The timeline is important because in 2012, Fauci wrote in a paper that, there is risk. This gain-of-function research is very risky. There is a chance that it could escape, but we think that the benefits outweigh the risks, is what he said in 12. Well, the Obama administration, for whom he worked in 2014, decided otherwise, and they put an end to any funding of gain-of-function research. Done. You can't do it. In 2017, as you point out, Trump, this is in December, so he had been president for certainly under a year. Quietly, this was the NIH announced it was resuming gain-of-function research, and it looks like Fauci was certainly behind the resumption of that, because now we see the receipts of them starting to fund through a cutout company the Wuhan lab doing the gain-of-function research. So we're seeing this timeline of Fauci getting more and more involved, and now we see Redfield, the former director of the CDC himself, who was not on our side during the pandemic of last year whatsoever, that's for sure, but he said that it looks like it's almost certainly a leak from a lab, for what it's worth.
And Senator Kennedy, when he was quizzing Fauci, they were talking about, and Fauci was sticking to his guns about, oh no, we didn't do this, there's no direct appropriation for them to be authorized to work on gain of function. And Kennedy pushed him in a very polite, quiet manner. He says, yeah, but how do you know?
Yeah.
And it's this fungibility. Yeah. And I don't know if you recalled, I was always involved with the fungibility argument when they had, when we were funding population control around the world, and people worried, well, do they use that for abortion? Oh no, we don't do it. We passed the Hyde Amendment, and we promised we're not going to spend any money on abortion, which is just, talk. It doesn't mean anything. That's what happens here. So they pretend that they said, you can't find it on to say, well, there's $600,000 or $1 million or $2 million here designated to experiment on gain of function. Nothing like that exists. But the people who were getting the money were involved in that, and they didn't call it that. And it's pretty hard, for to be kept up on every penny. But the other thing is if somebody does catch it and points it out, how many people are going to respond for it, because it was put there on purpose, and the people who put it there aren't going to say, you're right about that, we're going to have to correct that. That doesn't happen. The system is totally out of control.
I sent out an update to our readers for the Ron Paul Institute about a week or so ago, where I kind of used the analogy of Icarus flying too close to the sun with his wax wings. And it almost seems like this is the case with Fauci. He was riding so high that he thought nobody could touch him, and that's why he brazenly, if not lied, then certainly distorted the truth to several U.S. senators, including Senator Paul and others. And I think he came face to face with the reality that you just can't do that. But there are other things that he's been doing that are equally disgusting, and they're getting out, and I think it's also serving to tarnish his star. One of them recently reported on Fox News that he used, with about $500,000, he funded the University of Pittsburgh using the scalps of 5-month-old aborted babies and grafting them onto the back of mice to see what would happen. This is stuff out of Joseph Mengele, this kind of gruesome growing scalps on the backs of mice. And it's not related to COVID, but all of these things are coming together and portraying him not as the saintly grandfather who's getting us out of COVID, but of a very, very weird and creepy doctor who's doing bad things.
Right. That's interesting. I'd like to know what year that was because, I was at the University of Pittsburgh doing OB in the 60s, and I had some pretty serious conversations with my chief of staff, the head of the department, over the abortion issue because they were doing abortions, although they were still illegal. That was when I came to the conclusion that law catches up what the people do. Abortions weren't done because it got legalized. It was legalized because the people changed their attitude in the 60s and they wanted to endorse abortion. But that's a little bit off what we're talking about. But I wanted to go on about the staff. The Texas hospital staff, because this is interesting. Texas hospital staff says vaccine mandate breaks the Nuremberg Code.
Yeah.
Now you say, well, I wonder why they're getting all uptight about this, because almost everybody, it's a huge hospital organization, and almost everybody, ended up getting 99% of the 26,000 employees have had their vaccination.
Yeah.
But then there's still a few people that are concerned about the dictates, and I think they had quite a bit of number, 117 staffers. They're filing a lawsuit.
Yeah.
I think it's in Montgomery County.
Good for them.
Maybe they're better friends there. But it is a pretty important issue. But what I think about when you hear about this, because they say, oh no, you can refuse. There's nothing wrong with that. You have a right to refuse.
Yeah.
But you could still lose your job.
Yeah.
And that's exactly the way the Soviet system worked.
Yeah, of course.
What they did was, you can do that. You have a right of freedom of speech, and you have the right to buy and sell. But if you get caught, you lose your job.
Yeah.
We won't put you in prison. That'd be too much trouble. But it was always an economic punishment. You lose your apartment. You lose your food stamps and whatnot. And this is blackmail, is what it is. And then again, if it was really a disease that was going to wipe us off the face of the earth, it didn't turn out that way.
Yeah.
It turns out some of those figures, 99% of the people in some categories get better from it, and yet they're still forcing kids in many areas, to suffer the consequences. Maybe it'll lighten up as the year goes on, but right now it's been a mess.
It has. Now let's look at that second clip. This just underscores what we're talking about here. This is a piece in Bloomberg about this small group, 170 people, 170 some odd people, saying, hey, you can't force us to take this treatment for a number of reasons, primarily among which, and this is the Nuremberg issue, is that this is considered experimental. It has not been fully approved. Right. And they don't like that word, but it's not a derisive word. It's simply a descriptive term that this has not been fully approved by the U.S. For use. It is still in an experimental phase. And people say you can't force us to take an experimental medical procedure if we don't want to. And I think the good news about this, Dr. Paul, is that as much as as we still don't have so much faith in the courts, that is one venue that people are using and will increasingly be using, not only in cases like this, but also to fight back against lockdowns and to get some legal recourse and to get some justice for the damage done by lockdowns. And we've said it before, an army of pro-freedom attorneys should be out there fighting this battle for us, and they're starting to do so.
No,
that's encouraging.
That's the one of the last chances you have on changing bad laws and bad policy, and that fails quite frequently, but when it works, it's very, very beneficial. ultimately, it's you have to take the next step of defiance of the law and take the position that you're going to be a nonviolent objector to what's going on. But there are, and we've seen some cases where the judges have ruled favorably, and at least that'll make the opposition go to work and try to refute them. I think there's, I would think that's gotten better, say, in the last year or two than it was 5 years ago. That because of out of desperation, because now it should be a lot of opportunities when you think all this legislation is not legislation; it's executive orders at all levels of government. It has nothing to do what was the intent of the founders when they wrote our Constitution, and even they at the time recognized it to be imperfect. And I would say amen to that, because there certainly has been some loopholes in the Constitution. But as the founders worried, they said there'd be loopholes because the people themselves would have to be a moral people in order for this system to work. Right now, it's on the verge of not working, but hopefully we can help contribute to motivating people to try to make the system work and base it on some moral principles. Yeah.
And I guess the theme of our show today is kind of qualified optimism, because all of these stories are basically linked, and they sort of tell a semi-good news story, or at least a pro-justice story. The next one we want to talk about is actually a very good news story, and hopefully this will change the perspective a little bit of those that have had and recovered from COVID-19, which those people that have had it and recovered are about 99.8% of the people that have had it have recovered. And we're talking about millions and millions of Americans. Let's put up that next clip. This is a peer-reviewed study that was just released over the weekend, just before the weekend, in the scientific journal Nature. It was a worldwide study done by experts about whether, if you've had and recovered from COVID-19, you are immune from that disease from then on. And they have indeed discovered that people who recover from mild COVID-19 have bone marrow cells that can churn out antibodies for decades, although viral variants could dampen some of the protection they offer, essentially. Let's look at the next one. This is the sort of press release. The next one is the actual study. If we can just click on that next one real quick. Here's the study itself if you want to read it. Dr. Paul, I am not a scientist. I do not claim to understand the technical details about B memory cells versus what have you, but I do know, just being a layman that look at this, it looks like good news, and it looks like people like Thomas Massey and Rand Paul and others who said, hey, I've had it, I've gotten over it, I'm not going to get a jab, I'm not going to get a shot because I'm already immune, and I'm not going to pass it on to anyone else.
It is good news, and it is giving them a fit.
Yeah.
Because not only is it good news that people who have had it have immunity, it's better than the vaccine. And yet they're struggling to say, it doesn't count. It doesn't count. We want to see the vaccination, and we want to see your passport before you do anything. And if you don't do that, you can't have it. We cannot depend on nature doing this. But if you test these people, they have better immunity, it lasts longer, it's more natural, it's safer, and yet they want to make sure that the people submit to it, and the idea that people will have to get the vaccination, it looks like people are quite willing to do it. And to me, that is so dangerous, not because they really needed it or they're going to die from the vaccine. There are complications, but it's this idea that people became adapted to it, and they're adapted to it. Well, boy, this is a good idea. I've had some pretty good libertarians tell me, if this gets me on the airplane and gets me in that line a little bit faster, that this is probably worthwhile because it's probably not going to be that harmful, and medically it'll be less harmful than the danger of submitting to an authoritarian government because they're going to control where you go and what you do. They already have punish people going to churches and close down churches, but once again, maybe the court cases will help there. In some areas that has helped, but it's something that people will, if they continue to set the standard that the government tells you that you have to have the stamp of approval to do anything. Right now, it's indirect. The government didn't write a law. If you don't have it, you cannot work.
Yeah.
No. If you don't have it, the businessman becomes complicit.
Yeah.
He becomes a co-conspirator in all this, and because they have ways of blackmailing a businessman.
Yeah.
You know, there's so much control in the financial markets, and the big companies especially, they go along with this nonsense because they know that, you know, the appropriations process, the financial markets, the bailouts, the lockdowns has so much power. They say, we can't do it. The government's bigger than us, so we will submit, and that's why so many people have done this. And that's, I think when the dust settle from what's been happening this last year or two, that was probably the biggest issue of all, was the ill effects of the lockdown and the extensive harm it has done to our civil liberties.
Yeah, certainly. But the other thing that people can understand, hopefully, and take away from this is that there is strength in numbers. We do have the power. It's not always easy. It's not always you flip a switch and the bad guys go away. But we saw over the weekend in London thousands and thousands and thousands of protesters saying we don't want a vaccine passport. We're tired of this garbage. And the government announced, you know, we're no longer going to pursue this. Now, do you trust Boris Johnson? No, not for a second. But at least they're putting some pressure on him, just like the lawsuits are putting some pressure on people. So there is a way of fighting back, and hopefully, you know, if you want to look for a silver lining, hopefully we'll take some of that with us to prepare for the next time they try to hit us. But we want to talk our final topic about something that is both a good news and a bad news story. And it's a good news because of the miraculous properties, apparently, that this has. And this is the use of ivermectin to treat COVID-19.
Boy, that is. It looks to me, I lean toward the good news part of it. It's a shame that the way we have to come about this, because people literally had to defy the government. I mean, it's like hydroxychloroquine. It had been used for years and years and years, and it was well known, and a lot of doctors had experience with it. So as soon as Trump says, you know, it sounds like it might be a pretty good idea using hydroxychloroquine, yeah, that's when it was banned.
Yeah,
you know, it was banned, and finally they decided that was okay. Now, ivermectin is sort of a latecomer on this, and it is a drug for the treatment of infestations in animals, and evidently a good drug. But that's the way some things are discovered. And I mentioned to you, I was always fascinated with the story of penicillin, because some people said ivermectin, the new penicillin, because penicillin was generalized and actually can be adjusted by different doses for different kind of diseases, and it was developed during World War II, and it was accidentally found when there was some bacteria growing on a petri dish to find out different bacteria and what antibiotics would work. There was accidental contamination with a fungus, and somebody, you know, he made an observation. Didn't even cost the government a nickel. He made an observation. He said, hey, you look at that. There's this speck of fungus there, and the bacteria is not growing. So that's how they found out that you know, the origination and the discovery of penicillin came from the fungus. But then it became useful and was very important. But it still is not going to be allowed to be used, because right now it definitely is not technically permitted, you know, because it's only for animals, so that's bad. But there was a time when a lot of experiments were done. I think the smallpox vaccine was developed that way, because somebody noticed that people who had been infected with cowpox, you know, didn't get smallpox. So that just means that doctors should be very observant. Maybe some things, sometimes they're staring us in the face. One of my teachers in medical school, he says the one thing is, you know, it is complicated. But if you want to do a good job, just listen.
Just listen.
Just
yeah.
listen to your patient. They'll probably give you a very big hint on what's going on. So I think this is good, but it's sort of in limbo now on which way it's going to go, because I don't think the drug companies are going to give up easily.
No. Well, what's interesting is, you remember about a week or so ago, India was the worst in the world for COVID, and everyone was having massive panic attacks. India. Well, what's interesting in India is that parts of India started using massive amounts of ivermectin to treat the disease. And in fact, we have a couple of charts here. Let's put up that first one. India, after starting ivermectin, 80 to 90% drop in cases. So do they realize now what was the reason for the outbreak? And let's look at the next one. So you see there are two regions in India. Here's the whole graphic that shows at the peak when they started using ivermectin, and you see this massive, very, very rapid decline. Now, we don't know if that was a virus just kind of pooping out or if it was ivermectin, but certainly you see what appears to be a cause and effect. And here is something from an article written about it. Cases in Delhi where ivermectin was begun on April 20th dropped from 28,395 to just 2,260 on May 22nd. That represents an astounding 92% drop. Likewise, cases in Uttar Pradesh have dropped from 37,944 on April 24th to 5,000 on May 22nd, a decline of 84%. And again, it might be just that the virus was kind of losing its steam. However, this is sort of some counter evidence, Dr. Paul. Meanwhile, Tamil Nadu announced on May 14th that they were outlawing ivermectin in favor of the politically correct remdesivir. As a result, Tamil Nadu's cases are up in that same time frame of April 20th to May 22nd from 10,900 to 35,873, which is more than a tripling of cases. So viewing that together, where it's been outlawed and where it's been in use, and the radically different results, does suggest some sort of causal relationship.
You know, in medicine, in the private practice of medicine, there was still the principle of liability. You know, if you really mess up or you do something, if you're neglecting some part of medicine, you can get sued, and this puts the brakes on some of the activity there. But if you looked at lockdown and look at the damage done to a lot of kids, who's liable? Who should be liable for that? That would be a big deal, you know.
Yeah.
And who's liable for the people who didn't get hydroxychloroquine?
Yeah.
Who's liable for the ones that did not get because there was a delay in ivermectin? You know, but all of a sudden, because the government does it, they get immunity.
Yeah.
You know, well, matter of fact, this vaccine, they get immunity. And you know, and I know you look at the charts on CDC, the people who have reported complications, that list is getting longer.
It's big.
And but nobody's liable because it's the people who happen to be in the drug companies, and they're part of they're a function of the government, you know, and therefore you can't sue them. So it's a mess because there's too much government involvement, and I think the marketplace and the principle of liabilities and contracts, much better way to go with the practice of medicine.
The real question is, where is the justice for those tens or possibly hundreds of thousands of Americans who may have survived if they had access to ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine? How do they get their justice? They may have survived. If you remember, we were told only a few things. NPI, non-pharmaceutical interventions, those were only things acceptable, i.e. masks and social distancing. Do that, and staying inside. And then if you do get it, well, we'll put you on a ventilator. That helps a lot, blows your lungs up. And then, but eventually the vaccine is going to be the thing. So that was the only items on the menu, right?
Right.
Nasty vegetables, but then a juicy steak called, you know, other kinds of potential treatments were forbidden. So someone should pay for that. I'm just going to quit, Dr. Paul, by also being a little bit optimistic. You know, it's nice to get a little bit back to normal. We went to the Lone Star Flight Museum out in Houston. I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's a nifty little museum, a lot of neat airplanes, very intelligent. Best of all, very few people there wearing masks. They weren't required. Hardly anyone was wearing masks. And I can also report at our local HEB over the weekend, stocking up for the Memorial Day barbecue, I would say 85% of the people are not wearing masks, which is the opposite of how it was just a couple of weeks ago. So people maybe finally starting to come to their senses about things.
Very good. Now, I want to close with bringing up a subject we have brought up in the past. I think it's very important, and I think there's some positive things happen here, and that is the issue of nutrition. Because they do know that the elderly that may have some medical problems, they're in a nursing home, nutrition is very bad. But I think there's been more emphasis, on vitamin D and vitamin C and zinc and all these things. And hopefully I'm not slanted by the people that I hang around with, because there's a lot of people I know that I encourage them to do it, and they use it. And once again, it's a more natural way of taking things. Even the evidence for my old-fashioned recommendation to all my kids and grandchildren, it's good for you to get some exercise. Quit watching that TV. Go out there and play, and that is, exercise is very good too. So, and if you're going to exercise in the sun, then it's very beneficial. So I think there's been a more emphasis there, but also it's been said many times, and I will verify this is true, that when the average doctor goes through medical school, they haven't had very much training in nutrition. And a lot of times, either the exercise or the nutrition or natural cures for food, for all kinds of problems, is something that is not in formal education. So but it's good common sense. My dad didn't get to high school, but he was well educated, and he had a lot of good advice for. I was a family of 5 boys. He gave advice to us, but they were usually healthy advice, and so there were times either eating habits were different, and they had a work habit too. They thought that working was a good therapy for people. So that tell me, if any of us ever got in trouble, and I never got into any trouble, the punishment from my dad was go out and do a little bit of work in the garden. So this is it. So I think those things, and this is part of what this ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. It's all about. It's a little bit away and removed from this official monopoly that is made up of drug companies and government officials and bureaucrats, and that's why I think the case should be made, and hopefully we will report to you when it happens that Fauci has to go. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.